Hi, everyone. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today for our June webinar on U.S. regulatory pathways, plan for a successful submission. Today we've got Angela Mallery here with us. She's a principal product development strategist at North American Science Associates, or NAMSA. We're excited to have her here with us today. She's going to be talking to us about how to manage the market clearance process without becoming victim to common pitfalls. She's been in the medical device regulatory profession since 1992, and she's been with NAMSA since 2011. She has experience in regulatory, clinical, and quality, as well as a strong background working directly with the FDA. So before I turn it over to Angela, she'll probably get a little bit more in depth about her background, but I just want to cover a few housekeeping rules real quick. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in at any time over there on your control panel. You've got a questions tab. So we'll be keeping an eye on those and we'll address them all at the very end. So feel free to put those in there. And then also today's presentation will be recorded. So we'll have it available on our YouTube channel, and we put the link in our newsletter and up on social media. So you can always go back and rewatch today's presentation. But with all that being said, I think we're good to go. So Angela, feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So excited to be here today and talk a little bit more about regulatory pathways and submissions and things that I've learned along the way. I've been doing regulatory affairs for a very long time, back before we even had email, and we actually had to call FDA with questions and talk to real people. So seen a lot of changes. FDA today is a lot different than it was 20 years ago. It's a lot different than it was 5 years ago too. So I encourage you to sit back and listen, think about some questions, and I encourage you to ask questions. This seminar is for you. So please let's get those questions rolling so we can have a good conversation at the end. Great. So we all know what the plan is, right? The plan is a straight road, no roadblocks, no hurdles, no bad things. But in reality, we know all sorts of things happen. So just today, I got a notification from a client that our sterilization didn't go so well. So again, that is a big pitfall and something we didn't anticipate happening. So the reality is you have to plan for a little bit of delays in there and a little bit of plan Bs. So here, you're going to have copies of these slides. So I wanted to give you the types of submissions, some terminology, because you'll hear these terminology thrown around all over. There are 4 different types of 510Ks. There are traditional, special, abbreviated, and de novo. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later, but to give you an idea when we talk later on. PMAs, there's traditional and modular. There's IDEs, there's early feasibility, EFS. They're also called first in human, first in man. There's feasibility, there's pivotal. Some people give them phase names like 1, 2, and 3. There's significant risk and non-significant risk IDE trials. And then the HDEs, which are humanitarian device exemptions. So here's some more terms for you. Q-subs, these are also called pre-subs, pre-submission meetings. These are the submissions that you go to FDA and we get early feedback. 510Ks, the correct name for these is pre-market notifications, and those lead to a clearance. You have de novo 510Ks. These are low-risk devices that don't have a good predicate. PMAs, pre-market applications, those always lead to approvals. HDEs, which I just murdered right before this. SR and SR, significant risk, non-significant risk trials. And we've talked about the first in human, first in man, EFS, and IDEs already. All right. In the US, device classifications are broke down into 3 classifications. You have your low-risk devices, which are your surgical tools, things that you see in your doctor's office, things like that. Your class 2, which are moderate-risk devices. Again, those would be like your wound dressings, guide wires, things that aren't going to cause great harm to people. And then your class 3 devices, these are your high risk, your life-sustaining, your organ-sustaining devices. This is your heart valves, your permanent implants, and things that are risky like closed-loop software for pain management. Those are your risks. So if you look at this little cute chart up here, it kind of shows you what the classifications are, what kind of controls are required, where clinical data is generally required, and if it's a 510K or a PMA. This is a rule of thumb. This is not set in stone because, of course, with FDA, there are always exceptions to every rule. So here's another illustration of how device classifications are broke down. Class 1s are over half of the devices out there, and most of those tend not to go through any type of formal FDA clearance. And then your Class 2s are almost about half, and then your Class 3 is a very small percentage, but those are the ones that get all of the glory and all of the pain associated with them as well. Pre-submission meetings. I love pre-submission meetings, and I'm not just saying that. I really think that they are extremely valuable. I do quite a few pre-sub meetings. I generally do about one a month. So I was at FDA a week and a half ago doing one. I'm going to FDA the week after the 4th of July to do another one. And I find them invaluable because we go to FDA, we de-risk our regulatory strategy, we obtain early feedback on our animal studies, early feedback on our clinical studies. We are able to actually have an interactive discussion with FDA. We are able to understand where they are not comfortable with our strategy, where they're not comfortable with our technology. It is a wonderful thing to sit down face-to-face to FDA and have that conversation. That being said, you can also do these meetings by the phone, or you can just get written feedback as well. There's those 3 options. FDA does not charge for these meetings. So you can have these meetings with FDA. FDA does not charge a fee for this feedback, which is wonderful. You put together a packet of information for FDA. That packet of information generally includes the device description, brief instructions for use, and then it contains the data that you want to ask FDA about. So example, if you wanted to get feedback on your animal study protocol, you would include a good draft or a good outline of your animal study protocol to get feedback on. That packet is submitted to FDA. About 70 days later, you're going to get written feedback. And if you ask for an in-person meeting, that meeting happens around day 75. So, and you can always have more than one pre-sub meeting. Many of my clients go back over and over, and we have a series of them, especially for novel or interesting devices. So many devices now are breaking the mold. We are not making another guide wire. We are making software. We are making devices that are made out of materials that have never been used in medical devices before. So FDA does have some concerns, and we need to go back over and over again to talk about our animal study, our clinical study, our biocompatibility, things like that. So we can do them over and over again. Happy to talk about pre-subs all day long. All right, let's talk about our IDEs a little bit. So in case there is a zombie attack, we can design our zombie attack survival kit, right? So there's 2 types of clinical trials. There's significant risk trials and there's non-significant risk. So a non-significant risk trial would be a study where there is no patient involvement or no patient harm. So this is things like if you would put a pulse oximeter on someone's finger to get data, that's not going to do any harm. That would be a non-significant risk trial. But a significant risk trial would be if you were going to take that reading and make a medical judgment off of that. So that would be a significant risk trial. Study risk determinations can be made with a pre-sub. So if you're not sure, you can definitely go to your regulatory people and they can probably walk you through that process. If they're unsure as well, you can go to FDA and ask. Your IDEs will always include some sort of bench and animal data, some combination thereof. It will include your clinical plan, what you plan to do. You will have some statistics, so what you are planning to get out of the study, and it has to be prospective. There is no fee again for IDEs. There's a 30-day turnaround time that FDA reviews these in. Generally, what happens is you do your IDE, you submit it. FDA comes back with a disapproval initially, saying that you have to answer these, so many questions. Often it's 5-6 pages of questions, and you respond. So you respond to those questions. FDA, it goes back in the queue. They have 30 more days to review. I expect 2 to 3 rounds of those types of questions before you are able to start your clinical trial. That generally takes 4 to 6 months. So it's not just a 30 days, one and done. You need to plan a little bit of time, 4 to 6 months, and get your project manager people involved so you can start doing some other things in parallel paths to those. All right. So the other 2 types of IDEs that you'll hear mentioned is feasibility and a traditional or your pivotal trial. Your feasibility trial, that is where you demonstrate your proof of concept. You demonstrate that your device is safe in people. I use safe in quotes. So it's really demonstrating that your device works as intended in the model it's intended to do, because more than likely you've done some bench testing, you've done some animal testing. Let's make sure this works in people the same way we thought it would. And that's generally a very small number of patients. I would say 15 to 30-ish. You need to justify that number, but it's a small handful of patients. And then you have your traditional or your pivotal trial. And this is the whole enchilada. This is where you establish your safety and effectiveness. This is where you get your statistics to support your regulatory submission. This is where you see clinical trials have hundreds of patients in them, and you'll see them randomized and you'll see them stratified. So the traditional one or your pivotal trial is where you see the big number of patients involved in. 510Ks. Most of the devices that I work on are 510Ks, and it's a substantial equivalence pathway. And what I'm saying there is that your device that you are bringing to market is substantially equivalent to another device, a predicate device that is already on the market through the 510K pathway. And if you talk to any regulatory people, they can state the dates and all of this by rote. It's something that we do quite often. So your subject device is the device you're submitting to FDA, and your predicate device is the device you are comparing to. So looking at this middle thing here, a pre-amendment medical device legally on the market before 1976, or a class 2 medical device cleared by 510K after 1976. And substantial equivalence, so that's where I go to this picture at the top with the apple versus apple pie. So apples and apple pie, they're kind of the same thing, right? But are they equivalent? No. So that's where I talk about substantial equivalence, that it has the same intended use, and it has the same technology, or if it has different technology, it doesn't raise significant questions of safety and effectiveness that are not answered by testing. So we all know about lots of things like guide wires out there. Guide wires can be compared to other guide wires out there. If you all of a sudden made a guide wire that was biodegradable, I don't think there's another one out there like that. So your technology would be different enough that it wouldn't fit the 510K pathway. If you guys have questions about that, please start writing those down so we can talk about those. If you want to ask specific questions, feel free to do those too. If I can't answer specifically, we can talk about it offline too. So, like I said, 510Ks are the most common pathway. You almost always are going to have some bench and animal data. There are rare instances where you need clinical data. So, thrombectomy devices. I'm working on a device that is an implantable into the knee, and that has some clinical data. There's another one about a spinal fixation device that has some clinical data in it. So very few have clinical data. Generally, the ones that come my way are the more complicated ones, so that's why I see those. There is a fee for 510Ks. If you are a small business, if you make less than I think it's $100 million. I don't know who came up with that as a small business. That considers kind of big to me, but you do a submission to FDA to qualify as a small business, and your fee is about $2.7 thousand. Otherwise, it's about $11,000 for a standard 510K. The timeline is a 90-day cycle. So like the IDEs had a 30-day cycle, the timeline for the 510Ks is a 90-day cycle. What happens with this, though, is that when FDA comes back with significant questions, that 90-day clock stops until you answer those questions. You have 180 days or 6 months to respond to those questions. The clock starts again. So I generally tell folks that it takes 4 to 6 months to get through a traditional 510K pathway. You generally get questions from FDA around 45 to 60 days. Somewhere it's soft. You may get an interactive question early on. I got some this morning that were really silly, but okay, those are the ones easy to answer, right? Or you may get additional information later on. I got some of those questions on Monday. Some of those were not too easy to answer. So there is a balance there. So, and then here's an example that you can read later. Right. So there are special 510Ks. special 510Ks are minor changes to your device. So very likely you are modifying something that is important, but not super, super critical, and not completely changing your device. So for example, I just did a special 510K where I expanded my range of cannulas. My cannulas used to go from like 2 to 10, and now I do 1 to 15. So I went outside my range of cleared devices, and there were some additional risks, especially around reprocessing and cleaning. So I did a new 510K for those that qualified as a special because it was my device, and I did not change my intended or my indication for use. So I included my bench testing. No animal testing was needed. Very, very rare to include any type of clinical testing in a special 510K. The fees are the same. The good thing about special 510Ks is they have a 30-day review cycle, and FDA holds pretty tight to that 30 days. So if they send you questions back, they typically don't put you on a hold. So you generally can get your clearance in around 30 calendar days. Those are lovely. All right, take a little deeper dive into 510Ks, HDEs, and PMAs. So here's some examples of some 510K devices out there. You got your wound dressing, your dental putty, tanning beds. If you didn't know, tanning beds are 510Kable. They are. It's for treating conditions, skin conditions, not for tanning. And then wheelchairs. So, and here is a nice little breakdown of what happens to your 510K. You submit your 510K. Generally, the day you submit your 510K, you get your acknowledgement letter or your act letter. And that just gives you your 510K number. And that means you've successfully completed your e-copy. So those of you that know about the e-copy, that was introduced a few years ago. It brought a lot of angst to us because there are certain very specific things we need to follow about special characters and names and sizes of files. So it's the nitty-gritty about regulatory that drives us crazy sometimes, and that is the first thing that your device has to pass, is get through the documentation part. And then it goes through the refuse to accept process. FDA has a checklist that goes through all of the items that they are looking for, and FDA will then send you a RTA. It's a refuse to accept acknowledgement that you've passed. Then FDA starts reviewing. In actuality, it probably sits on someone's desk for a while, but by day 60, and as I said, between day 45 and day 60, FDA generally will start asking you those questions. And then it says by day 90, they will issue their decision. And if they don't, by day 100, they will give you a letter that they have not reached their decision yet. So that's very kind of them. So we talked a little bit about de novos earlier. So these are for low-risk devices that don't have a good predicate. So if your device is novel, but not novel enough that it's going to create high risk, you might fall in the de novo pathway. And it is an avenue to get through FDA without going through the PMA pathway, which we'll talk about in a little bit, for low-risk devices. And what it does is it allows FDA to reclassify your device as a Class 2 and create a new category for you. So it's about indications and technology, just like 510Ks if you can't find a good predicate. Very common to include bench and animal data. About half of these will require some sort of clinical data because you need to demonstrate that you are as safe and as effective as the other devices that are in your group. So if you're making a new knee, even though your knee is completely different and amazing, you still have to be as effective and like, quote, like the other knees out there. So you might need to do some clinical data to show that. The fees for de novos have gone crazy up in the last few years. So right now for a small business application, they are $24,000. For a standard company, they are $96,000. And their review cycle is a lot longer too. They have a 150-day review cycle. And normally you get your de novo recommended in a year. So about 12-month review cycle. So they have a lot more data than a 510K. they are more expensive, and they take longer to get through. But the good news is that you have something on the market that is novel and hopefully cool and amazing. All right, let's talk about HDEs. So I want to draw your attention to this image. So imagine this device. This is by Thorax, who did a PMA for a similar device for reflux. So now they've taken this technology and they're putting it in the GI system as an external anal sphincter. So this device is novel because there are other artificial sphincters out there. There are none that are made out of magnets. So what FDA has done is said, okay, there's a small number of patients that would benefit from this device, less than 8,000 patients a year. You've done a small clinical trial to demonstrate it's effective, but it's different enough that, and it's risky enough that we don't want to do a full PMA and we don't want to do a 510K. It doesn't really fall in either one of those buckets. So we're going to call it an HDE because it has a small patient population and it has some significant risks to it. Part of those risks are mitigated because when this gets approved, you have to put it in a hospital that is going to get IRB approval, and you have to follow up these patients and eventually try to seek PMA approval for these. So these are interesting. There's also some pediatric ramifications and some cost ramifications associated with them. These used to be really popular about 15, 20 years ago, not as popular anymore since the de novo route has come out. Oh, and then our PMAs. So I think all of us can agree that yes, heart valves are definitely PMAable. They are high-risk devices. They are not eligible for the 510K path. You don't claim substantial equivalence. These need to stand on their own. It's super, super common to have bench and animal data in them, and 90% of all PMAs will have some sort of clinical data. I've been doing regulatory affairs for a really long time, and I've seen one PMA that did not have clinical data in it. And that was submitted over a year ago, and it's still under review. So there's pros and cons to that, because had clinical data, it might have gone through easier because we could have shown that the differences between our device and the other devices out there were not significant. But without clinical data, we're relying on animal data and just our bench testing. All right, the fees. So fees for PMAs have blown out the roof. So if you are a small business and it's your first PMA, you can generally get those for free. If it is not your first PMA, they're about $81,000. Or a standard, if you're Medtronic or Boston, you're going to have a fee of $322,000. And those are for fiscal year 2019. FDA's fiscal year changes on November 1st every year, so expect those to go up. But also the thing that people need to realize about PMAs is that you are required to do an annual report to FDA. Those are about $10,000 to do every year. You submit an annual report to FDA to have them review them. And anytime you do a change, and I say anytime in quotes because there are a few that don't, but 80% of all the changes you make to your device, whether it's an inspection, a material, changing a specification, those require you to go back to FDA and get approval for those changes. And those all have fees associated with them. So I typically tell clients that I would expect to pay about $100,000 a year in change fees. It's just the way it goes. The review cycle for these is, your first cycle is 180 days. You request a pre-sub meeting around day 100, or you request a pre-sub for a day 100 meeting that happens around day 100, where you get your first round of questions. A PMA typically takes about a year to get through. As I was mentioning, the one that I worked on a while ago, it's this December it'll be 2 years that it was submitted, and it's still going around. So there is basically an unending series of holds and starts with PMAs. And like we talked about earlier, few PMAs happen. I tend to see these early on because small startup companies don't have the bandwidth. By the time they get to PMA, you really need a full house of people to deal with this. There's a type of PMA called a modular PMA, and really what that is, it's a PMA that's broken down into chunks. So you have modules, typically 2 to 4, and you generally put these in order of availability. So your first modules are generally your bench testing or your animal testing, things like that. Then your last module is what you have the longest lead time on. Usually that's your clinical module. So what happens is you put together your module plan, you go to FDA, and they approve your plan. And you schedule these modules about 3 to 6 months apart, and FDA will come back with questions for you. Each module does not have a time frame associated with it. The time frame is associated with the submission of the last module. So once you submit your last module, the 180-day clock starts there. So the benefit of doing modular PMAs is it gets the easy stuff out of the way first. So it gets the bench testing done out of the way. And I call that easy because hopefully you've done your due diligence, you have your testing done and wrapped up, and you can put a pretty bow on it, while in parallel to FDA reviewing this, you can be working on your clinical trial reports. So by no means is it an easier path. It just breaks it out differently. All right, so if I was looking at a timeline for a 510K or a PMA or an IDE, first you get your strategy and define your device. However you do that, you look for predicates for your 510K. I highly recommend a pre-sub meeting at that point to define your regulatory strategy, to vet that out, because every once in a while FDA surprises me, and I love when they surprise me, mostly for the good, for the testing and ideas around predicates, things like that. I want to make sure that I'm going down the right path. Then you do all of your testing, lots and lots of testing. While you're doing your testing and that's coming back, you're, as a regulatory person, you are writing and organizing the submission. Generally, I tell my people that within 7 days of the last deliverable, I'll get the 510K out. That's assuming that I don't get 20 deliverables on that last day, right? So you got to plan ahead. So let's talk about the product development plan from a regulatory perspective. So basically, project management of a medical device, bringing it to market from a regulatory perspective. All right. So as regulatory people, we feel like we're the magic 8 ball of the universe sometimes. So because we get asked all these amazing questions, I had a client ask me today, well, what do you think's going to happen? I don't know. If I knew what would happen, I would be sitting in Jamaica winning the lottery. But so I can guess because I've been doing this for a long time. But so back to here, we take an idea and we make it real, or we make it as real as we can, right? And then you make sure it works. You make sure it does what it's intended to do. You make sure that you can make it effectively. We don't want a device that you can't make, right? You want to make sure it's cost effective. Worst thing you can do is bring a device to market that you're losing money on. So you got to think of that too. And then make sure it's what your customers need. So you all walk through Target and see stuff on the counters and the shelves that you're like, who would ever need this? So make sure your medical device fits your customers' needs. Your regulatory strategy. Start this early, very, very early, and you need to update it constantly. So your regulatory strategy includes your path to market. So if it's a 510K, you need to get your predicate devices chosen, and you need to understand what that predicate device looks like and if it's available. Or if you're doing a PMA, you need to get that in front of management right away, because they need to understand that this is the long pole in the tent and you got some long-term obligations. The regulatory strategy also includes some testing plans. So while the engineers do a lot of that work, we need to understand if there are FDA guidance documents or standards out there that we need to follow. And then is there a clinical study planned? So we need to figure that out. And again, pre-submission meetings with FDA. Start at feasibility, kick it off in the right way. If you're going to do an IDE, agree on that clinical trial study and the testing that you need to get going. If you're going to do a pre-PMA, pre-510K, agree on the type of data that's going to go in there. Again, I could talk about pre-subs all day long. They are invaluable to this process and one of the amazing things that FDA has put out. All right, I love this picture. So it makes me happy, and it makes me happy to talk about testing. So there are lots of different types of testing out there. These are the type of testing that you'll hear about associated with medical devices. Bench testing. So these are all the things that can happen in the lab. You have your biocompatibility testing. So that is testing to make sure that our product isn't reacting badly to a person, either if it's implanted or on the skin or on a mucosal membrane. You have electrical testing, which I tell people is to make sure that it doesn't blow up. When you plug it in, you don't get those sparks. Your software testing to make sure it does what you're telling it to do. And sterilization, making sure that it's sterile. So yes, some of these things can all fit in the same category, but these are the words that people will use when they're talking about testing. So some things about testing: always have great protocols. Always have protocols for testing that you're going to put in your submission. 99 times out of 100, FDA is not going to ask you for those protocols for IDEs and 510Ks. Every once in a while, they surprise you, so make sure you have them. In your protocols, also always include a sample size justification, and it needs to be robust and it needs to be valid. So it needs to be, we chose 22 units based on statistics, and we chose this size because it is the best representation of the entire lot. Deviations happen. So you're going to have your protocol, you're going to set up what you're going to do, and then you're going to deviate. Deviations always aren't bad. It shows that you are following your protocol, that things happen. I have seen devices get dropped, get run over by chairs, be over manipulated and break. That happens. Bad things happen too. I see devices fail. If a device fails, it's not the worst thing that can happen, right? Because we expect them to fail as long as we can justify why that is not catastrophic. And I can always help you with that. Animal testing. It's not something we like to talk about, but it's something that is necessary for medical devices. So this picture is an image of what a tattoo looks like into your skin. Interesting, huh? I thought that was a cool picture. So what you have an animal study to do is it's to make sure that your device works safely. The primary thing is to make sure that the device works in a manner that it's supposed to, and it's not going to cause harm. There can be some efficacy designed into these studies, but you are going to mimic a human study as much as possible to make sure that the device is not doing things that you didn't expect. I have seen animal studies where we have thought nothing was going to go wrong, and the animal dies. And we're like, okay, that's a one-off, right? We do it again. The animal died again. So we need to go back and find that root cause and figure out what's triggering that in an animal. We had no idea. All the other testing came back beautiful. Did not work in a living model. So we also need to talk about GLP, good laboratory practices. Ideally, everything that goes into your submissions, your IDE, your 510K, your PMA, your animal tests all go through GLP. Ideally, there are some one-offs to that as well, but let's make that the exception and not the rule. Also in your protocols, include your sample size justification. These sample sizes are going to be small, right? I was working on one today that was a sample size of 2. Then also look for your animal model justification. So what are the models? What's the justification for your model? I'm sorry, my phone's ringing in the background. And then your endpoint justification. So what is the justification for your endpoint? Then let's talk about our clinical study. All right. So make sure that your plan is robust. Make sure a lot of people review it, right? Better eyes make for a better study. But keep it simple. I worked for a boss that would use lots of big words. And these big words, no one could understand what they meant. So keep it simple and keep it straightforward. If you don't know what a word means, feel free to ask. I asked FDA last week what a word meant. Quiescence. If you didn't know what quiescence means, it's like quieting down of an animal study model. In your clinical study, you want to keep up with the changes to your device that happen. Your device is going to change. Make sure you tie that to your clinical devices. So if you all of a sudden change packaging, yes, that has to go through the IDE approval process, but is there any ramifications for your results tied to that change? And again, for your report, keep it simple, but match your plan. Go back to your plan and make sure it all matches. So you'll be reviewing clinical plans. Hopefully you won't be writing them, but who knows? I've written a few. And then let's talk about our commercial submission. So this is the formula for caffeine, which you will need lots of when you're writing these. So what typically goes into your commercial submission, this is your 510K, your PMA, HDE, your de novo, labeling. So your labeling includes what I call the sticky labels. So the labels that go onto your pouches or your trays or your box, your sticky labels. You have your instructions for use, often referred to as an IFU or your manual that goes in the box as well. You will have your bench testing and your shelf life testing. So you have to demonstrate that you meet specifications at time 0 and at shelf life. You need to validate that your packaging keeps the device safe and sterile. So you need to do packaging and shipping validation. You need to do your sterilization validation, make sure that your product is sterile over time. Biocompatibility, again, making sure that we don't get any of those irritations or bad reactions. For your PMAs, you need to do process validations, making sure all your processes are repeatable, your animal testing, and then again, your clinical study results or some combination of real-world evidence to support that, or that it's not needed. All right, here's a brief summary of what's the difference between a 510K and a PMA. One is the cost, right? $10,000 versus $300,000. The review period for a 510K is about half of what a PMA is. And the turnaround time, 4 to 6 months versus 12 months. The other differences for a PMA is that you are required to go through a pre-PMA inspection at your facility and your significant contractors if you haven't gone through one in the last 2 years. And then your BIMO audit, which is an audit of your clinical data, is also possible before your submission or right after it. So you can see that just from the guts of what happens with your 510K and PMA, the PMAs are a lot more rigorous. They're also a lot bigger. I mean, your 510K is probably, without software, your 510K is probably 500 pages. The last PMA that I printed, this is before, we don't have to print them anymore, but the last PMA I printed was 38 boxes of documents. So that's a lot of documents versus, not that for your 510K. All right, so these are things to keep in the parking lot of your mind. So if you are almost ready to submit your PMA or 510K, you need to make sure that you have your DUNS number, which your Duns and Bradstreet number for U.S. companies. It's basically an identification number. You need to pay your user fees, make sure that you are in the right fiscal year, you have all of your ducks in a row, you pay your fees early, get your payment identification number. Then, if you're almost ready to commercialize, so you've done this, you've blown through, you're ready, you got your clearance, you're ready to go, you need to get your establishment registration number and your device registration. So these are pretty straightforward. It takes some time to work through the government website, but it's one of those things you can do with the TV on in the background, right? Because you got to click around a lot and do a bunch of stuff, enter a lot of things over and over again. But those are things that you need to do before you commercialize. All right, let's talk about some fun things. So we have about 5 minutes left, so let me breeze through these and talk about things that I have found in my years of experience. I've also gone to FDA and asked them, what makes submissions better? How can I make submissions better for you? So in no particular order, make sure your protocols and your plans match. So if you say that you're doing 5 units and you only test 4, tell me why and give me a good reason why. Consistent use of terms or explain stuff. So at the beginning of your project, if it's a long project, you're going to have a code name for your project, right? You're going to start with code name Phoenix. And then as your product goes by and your marketing people get involved, they're going to change the name to something unique and hopefully descriptive and not the name of an animal, which seems to always happen. So it'll change, but your information that you submit to FDA might have 3 different names in it. So you need to explain that. Understand the changes that happen to your project over time. So sometimes things change. You started with a tray in a tray design and you switch to a pouch in a pouch design. You might have some overlap of those testing. You need to understand where those happen and their impact on the submission. You need to project that have obviously everything that goes into your submission. Don't leave anything up to chance. Know your stakeholders. So you may think your stakeholders are your team, but you're going to have hidden stakeholders as well. So your hidden stakeholders are your president of your company that told the board that the submission is going in December 31st. So you got some additional stakeholders out there that have some pretty heavy fingers going into the submission, yet they don't have anything to do with the submission itself. And then know your goals. So in that case, that was a real case actually, is that I had to do a submission by December 31st. That was my goal, had to be met, had to absolutely be met or we would lose funding. So there were things that I did not make sure were absolutely fantastic in the submission. Did the best we can, but where we didn't have data, we did the best we could with the information we had because we had to get it in. We knew our goals. All right, right to be understood, write simple, limit your use of adjectives. When you say something is very clean, what do you mean by very? Just say that it's clean. Limit your use of Latin, that is i.e., e.g., etc., because use the real words. And as kids say now, too long didn't read, use white space. Throw strunk and white out the window. Use white space to spread out your sentences, spread out pictures, make it readable. Everything you're submitting to FDA is electronic. You don't want a whole page of just words. Imagine if this slide was just all words. You wouldn't read it. As I said before, everything is in e-copies now. So we used to be worried about including attachments. We don't worry anymore. When in doubt, include it because it's just an e-copy. It's just another file. Remember your audience. Everything we do is for FDA. So it's not for your boss. It's not for your team. You're writing everything for FDA. Just keep that in mind. Headings, tables, and figures, table of content. If you can do auto table numbering, table of content, that will change your life, change your world. It is amazing. All right, a couple more slides. You want to show, tell, and show. So you want to tell FDA what your results are, what you did, then show them some pictures and some data, and then conclude again by telling them what they did. Always include the description of your device, that it's finished device, that it's aged, that it's sterilized. You want to include specifications. Like we talked about before, always include your statistical justification for your sample size. It's okay to have failures and deviations. Include these. Include reports in your appendices. Here's some information on software. I'll let you read that. Electrical testing. Again, if you're doing a device that it has an electrical component that plugs into the wall, you need to do the IEC 60601 series of testing on that. Here's some specific information about guidances, biocompatibility, and sterilization. All right. So lessons that I have learned. How you learn to do a 510K is by practicing, by doing it a lot, and listening to others. So it's great to have templates. It's great to have all of that, but get in there and get your hands dirty and just do it. Put yourself in FDA's shoes. So don't use terminology that FDA is not going to understand. Don't use internal terminology. Make sure that it's clear and it flows. You're not going to get this back graded, right? You're not going to get a grade on your grammar. So feel free to make it work for you. I always put my conclusions first and show my data and then I'll draw conclusions again. make sure you go back to your pre-subs and make sure that you answered all of the questions that they asked you. And it's so easy not to do that because you think that you've answered their question. You need to actually go back and reread it and sit back and make sure you've answered it. Go back to the FDA guidances that you thought you were complying to. They change. I submitted a 510K, and the day I submitted it, out came a new guidance on cybersecurity. Yep, that was fun. And then make it as perfect as possible. We know it will never be. When you go back and look at your submissions, you always find things that are wrong. So thank you so much. Here is Dwayne's contact information. Chris is in the room with you as well, so you can feel free to ask him questions. So that wraps up my presentation. So please ask questions. I'm here. I would love to get this party started.
Yeah, I think we've got some questions here, but I also want to remind people tuning in online to feel free to drop them in right now, and I'll go ahead and read those. But we can go ahead with the ones here.
One's a little outside of scope. So this might be a little outside of the scope of this presentation, but I was curious, do you guys help at all with the GMP side for the manufacturers? So after you've gotten the
Yeah, so we can help with that. It's part of the quality system, so that's definitely something that NAMSA can do. You know, is to help with that. It's just making sure that you have practices in place, good documentation, and that you follow through on protocols and reports and things like that. Yep, we can help.
What's the typical timeline with that, and how often do you have to, I guess, work with the FDA to get that certification?
So you should start developing your quality system when you are ready to start testing your devices for FDA. So not in feasibility, but if you're going to start building devices to test them, you should be under a full quality system at that point. And that's when you need to have GMP in place. You need to be able to demonstrate to FDA that the devices that you're testing are representative of final finished devices. So they may be a little bit different, but you should be following the same practices and the same type of equipment. FDA will come, and if you're doing a 510K, FDA will put you down to be audited sometime 2 to 4 years, probably, after you receive clearance. And like I said, with PMAs, more than likely you will have a pre-inspection audit.
What other questions do we have? Anyone? Okay. We got a lot of people thinking in the room, but I haven't seen any come in online, and we're doing pretty good on timing. If we don't have any more questions here, we're lucky enough to have Chris here in the room with us. So if you think of some, he's here for us, and we've got contact information included in the presentation, which again is recorded. But other than that, I think we're good. Angela, thank you so much for joining us today, for your time, and for all this insight. Otherwise, I think we're good to go. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. This is great. This answered all my questions, that's for sure.
Yeah, you did a good job. All right, well, everyone, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and feel free to follow up with this contact information, or if you have any questions for us.
And Angela is going to send us the deck, so you can reach out to Kelsey or myself, Connie Annabelle, and we will send it to you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Very good. How's it going? Good.
So I have a question for you.